Cuando se creó la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, nunca fue concebida como una institución educativa en sí, sino como un ideal, como una causa y como un poderoso agente de transformación. Esta es la diferencia entre la UFM y cualquier otra. La academia es el vehículo, claro, pero no el destino de lo que hacemos. Desde su primer día de vida hasta este preciso momento, la Universidad Francisco Marroquín ha existido para encontrar y nutrir mentes brillantes y para plantar en ellas la urgencia de preguntar, argumentar, transformar y elevar la realidad que les rodea. Nos urge la obligación de cuestionar los dogmas, sean del tipo que fueren. Nos rebelamos contra las tradiciones. Vivimos para crear nuestro propio destino, no para seguir mecánicamente reglas impuestas por otros. Existimos para forjar nuestros propios pensamientos, no para creer a ciegas en los hallazgos de terceros, por sublimes que parezcan. Creemos en el individuo, único con capacidad de pensar, razonar y actuar. ¿Por qué? ¿Cómo? ¿Qué pasaría si? Este es el inicio más frecuente de las conversaciones en nuestras aulas. Creemos que no hay herramienta más poderosa que las preguntas, ni fuerza capaz de doblegar las ideas. Por eso no nos interesan las respuestas prefabricadas. Para nosotros, no hay verdades absolutas. Creemos en la libertad como en nuestra brújula y en la responsabilidad como en nuestro norte. Nos inspiran los ideales y acciones de pensadores, maestros y fundadores, individuos que han transformado la historia. Nos consume buscar, encontrar y acompañar a jóvenes mentes en su búsqueda personal y dotarlas de las herramientas para que al cambiar su destino, alteren la historia y empujen adelante a su comunidad, a su país y a su planeta. Estas no son simples palabras. Llevamos 50 años actuando. ¿Tienes alguna pregunta?
Hi everyone. On behalf of the Centro Henry Hazlitt at Universidad Francisco Marroquín, I welcome you to today's conference. I am María José Díaz, a student of the Instituto of Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales.
And I am Luis Brichot, also a student of the Instituto de Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales. Together we are going to talk with Chris Lingle in the conference, What's the relationship between political power and human liberty?
The topic of this conference is to discover what is the relationship between political power and human liberty. Today is a great day to discuss this topic because today was the day that the Berlin Wall fell back in 1989. The Berlin Wall was a barrier that surrounded West Berlin and prevented access to it from East Berlin and adjacent cities of East Germany during the period of 1961 to 1989. That is one example of how political power affected human liberty and how political ideas had to confine humans in an effort to suppress their liberty. Over the years, the wall became a grim symbol of the Cold War. By 1989, many East Germans had had enough. They staged a series of mass demonstrations demanding democracy. On the night of November 9, 1989, an East Berlin party official announced upcoming travel reforms in response to the protests, but botched the message so badly it sounded as if East Berlin had in fact opened its borders. As East Berliners pushed through, tens of thousands of West Berliners met them in a massive outpouring of emotion and celebration. As they celebrated with champagne, music, and tears, Berliners began to literally tear down the wall with sledgehammers and chisels. Less than a month later, the GDR collapsed entirely, and in 1990, Germany reunified. The Soviet Union followed suit, and today, the fall of the Berlin Wall is seen as a symbol of the end of the Cold War. We can talk about examples like this one for a long time, but to mention a current country where endless political power affects human liberty is North Korea, country that remains among the world's most suppressive countries. that country's government sharply curtails forms of freedom, religion, conscience, peacefully assembly, and association. It prohibits political opposition, independent media, NGOs, and trade unions.
At these examples, we ask ourselves, does freedom flourish under political power? What is the best political system for liberty? Which is the worst? Can political power be compared to human liberty? To discuss this, we have Chris Lingle. Chris earned a doctorate in economics from the University of Georgia in 1977. Since then, he has been employed at universities in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and USA. He's a passionate supporter of human creativity and voluntary actions that lead to social harmony. To this end, he constantly travels to engage in discussions on the merits of institutions and public policy in terms of their impacts on human liberty and dignity. Currently, he's a visiting professor of economics in the Escuela de Negocios at UFM, adjunct scholar at the Center of Independent Studies in Sydney, research scholar at the Center for Civil Society in New Delhi. His research interests are in the areas of political economy and international economics, with a focus on emerging markets economies and public policy reforms in East and Central Europe, East Asia, Latin America, and Southern Africa. Please, students and the general public that are attending this conference, write your questions in the conference post, and we're looking forward to answering them in our question and answer segment at the end of this conference. Chris, thank you very much for your presence.
By the way, my email address is there in case you don't get to ask questions, so please copy that. And now, in the introduction, the references to the Berlin Wall and the repression that was associated with the Berlin Wall is very relevant today. I think if we had put pandemic policies as the reference point rather than the Berlin Wall, we would have the same description of the political and economic realities of today. And this is what I will discuss, although I'll put it in a broader framework. Most of my concern today is that the pandemic policies have been as repressive and have been as problematic as the Cold War doctrines that we saw in the Soviet Union, Red China, and Cuba, the other places that pursued those repressive policies. It turns out that we no longer, it seems, have liberal democracies. We have liberal democracies in the past that have followed the example of the Chinese Communist Party regime and have introduced extensive repressions on individual or human liberty, which is what I'll discuss. So let's look at a few quotes. Many of you know this, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, according to Lord Acton, a famous historian, British historian. Adam Skelter, who's not a philosopher, but in fact a Hollywood producer and writer, suggests that power is very problematic. It's a hammer, and that we need to be very conscious of this. And another Hollywood actor, but this doesn't mean that these are not insightful comments. Abuse of power isn't limited to bad guys in other countries. It happens in our own country. And of course, he was referring to the United States in this regard, but I think this is a relevant observation. So the point is that we need to be worried about power. Now, let me give you a sort of brief outline. First of all, I'm going to talk about the nature of power, what power is, and then the tensions between human liberty and power. What is the role of democracy in terms of limiting or expanding power? And then we will compare the market order with what I will call the political order. And then, as I mentioned, we'll look at pandemic policies, power, and human liberty. These are the sort of general themes that I will discuss in the subsequent presentation. Now, we'll start with the nature and sources of power. Now, power is generally this idea of the ability to compel other people to do something maybe that they don't want to do, or to get people to do something that you want them to do, whether they want to do it or not. So it suggests a sort of compulsion or force. Now, what are the sources of power? Well, there are many, or at least several here. I'll talk about the political origins of power, and then I'll talk about the economic origins and sources of power. Of course, there are other ones, social and from family and from culture in general. These I will suggest to you will be less important, or at least not the focus of our attention. I will focus primarily on the political and economic power, okay? Now, a quick comment about political power. Political power emerges from the system of political governance that allows the actors, the political actors, whether bureaucrats or elected politicians, to use force or, in the limit, even violence to get people to do what they want people to do. And we will look at how do these political actors decide on what must be done. It could be ideology. It could be the suggestions of experts. It could be simply arbitrary. So political power is, as we will see in a moment, it could be arbitrary. It could be based on expert opinion, or it could be based on partisan politics or ideology. So the origins of political power are many. Now, economic power is somewhat different. Now, it can be acquired from political power, and that is a particular aspect. For example, politicians or bureaucrats, government agencies could restrict competition to grant to a particular firm or business, or maybe an industry, some sort of privileges that involve restrictions on competition, protections on the basis of tariffs or quotas. And in other words, this type of political economic power really is based on political power. On the other hand, a particular business could acquire some amount of power by engaging in cooperative behavior. Now, this kind of power, we will see later, is quite transient. It's temporary. It's not guaranteed. It's not based upon the state or government political actors giving a privilege. It's based upon the voluntary interactions between buyers and sellers that generate a certain amount of a capacity for a particular company or business to be dominant for a certain moment in terms of a something that they offer to the general public. Now, in terms of the social and family, I'm not going to discuss this because it's not always easy. It's not easy to escape our family dominating us, but it is possible. It's not always easy to escape the social pressures that are imposed on us, but it is possible in a way that it's much more, as I will discuss, it's much more difficult to escape political power because you either have to immigrate or you have to engage in a revolution, maybe even an armed conflict with the state. Whereas with a social, you can escape from the pressures of the social pressures by ignoring them or accepting whatever punishments are involved. And you can even escape your family if you need to. And many people do this. May not be comfortable, but it's possible. Okay? So we'll be more concerned with economic power and political power. That's what we'll be focusing on. Now, governance affects human actions. So we're going to look at two types of governance. Political governance, which is state power. And as we know that the power of the state is that they have the legal capacity to impose force or even violence. So they have a legal monopoly on the use of force against citizens. Now, on the other hand, we have self-governance and individual sovereignty. So this involves choice. So self-governance means that you choose how you live your life. Political governance involves political actors, politicians or bureaucrats deciding on what it is you can do or what you must do. Self-governance is discovering your own life purposes and pursuing them within this sort of broad framework. We'll discuss again in a moment a rule structure that we generally call the rule of law that limits what the individual can do in the sense that it is both legal and moral as long as you don't interfere with other individuals' rights and liberty to pursue their own lives. Now, if we think about power, power tends to interfere with the purposive, the self-selected, the subjectively determined choices for humans to act. In other words, power is trying to direct people or control human actions. So these are two sort of conflicting forces. On one hand, power is directing people or controlling people or forcing people, whereas human actions are the choices of people to try to live their own lives, to live a fulfilling life, to live a life that improves their conditions. So if we look at political power, as I mentioned a moment ago, political power involves threats, compulsion, and punishment. So political power allows the political actors to threaten us, to compel us, and to indeed punish us. We can be imprisoned for not following the dictates of the political actors, the politicians and bureaucrats. They are allowed to force us to do things that we may not wish to do. Now, it could be things that are good for us, but they may not be. They may be good for someone else. And this will be the essential problem. Now, the issue of political power is that they're very difficult to resist or to challenge, to contest. It's difficult to resist because they have the power to use force over us. And they're difficult to contest because elections, for example, if we live in a democracy, elections come every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. And even then, it is us against the majority. So political power, once it is developed, it's very difficult to resist or to contest. Now, of course, in an autocracy or a dictatorship, it's even more difficult. But even under democracy, it's difficult both to resist or to contest. And it tends to be permanent. Once we have political power invested in the state or whatever the political system may be, it tends to be permanent. Part of the reason is that when legislatures meet, they very seldom evaluate or investigate the nature of existing rules. They tend to actually expand the existing rules rather than examine what's been passed before and try to eliminate those things that might be obstructive or irrelevant or out of date. In fact, the entire purpose of most legislation is to expand the existing set of rules that we must follow, not ever to diminish them. So once a rule is implemented, through the political process, it tends to be permanent. Now, it could be reversed, but there's a weak incentive for political actors to go back and evaluate existing rules to see which ones are irrelevant or obstructive, or in other words, if they interfere with the possibilities of the community to improve themselves. And as I mentioned, political power involves the legal use of force or violence. Now, violence is not always present, but it is always a potential. Any piece of legislation, even under democracy, has at the limit the possibility that the state actors could use extreme violence against citizens. So, for example, even a trivial requirement, such as paying a small tax on a particular product, if you resist the state actors are legally allowed to use violence to either suppress your activities or to stop you in some way or to imprison you. If you resist, and even if they kill you, even if they murder you, they may not be held liable because it is something that they are allowed to do. They are allowed to use that violence. And if the violence leads to death, in most instances, they will be exonerated or they will not be held liable for it. Now, let's contrast political power with what we might call economic power. Now, in the sense that a company or that economic power exists that is in the hands of a company or a producer, it is the outcome of an interactive process. That is, individuals choose to voluntarily interact. They make a bid and the producer makes an offer. So this is a negotiation process. It's not a threat. It is you decide that you want to interact with this particular company. And if you don't like what they are offering, you can walk away. So it's easier to avoid the economic power where it might exist. So for example, Amazon is a very dominant player in terms of internet provision of goods and services. But you don't have to use Amazon. You can go to Oakland Mall, you can go to Estación here in Zona Viva, or you can find another online provider. So it's easier to avoid economic power than it is state power, because state power tends to be omnipresent. It's everywhere. Because once they set these rules, they affect all citizens, and they can use compulsion to force you to abide with their requirements. But Amazon cannot force you to buy from them. Now, economic power is easily to be contested, unless, of course, it's protected by the state. So economic power, where it might exist, tends to be temporary. So, for example, many of you may not remember Netscape or Internet Explorer. Both Netscape and Internet Explorer were the dominant web browsers of a certain moment, but they've more or less disappeared. What was the MySpace? Before Facebook, there was something known as MySpace. If you go back to the news reports of say 10 years ago, MySpace was going to take over the world, but it was replaced by Facebook. And we will see eventually that Facebook has already disappeared, except for old people like me. Your generation relies less on Facebook than previous generation. It will also disappear. It will become somewhat irrelevant and will have much less impact on people's lives. And the reason is innovation will lead to replacements, so that what seems to be a dominant player at one moment in time will be replaced by another dominant player, which will be replaced by another dominant player, and so on. So that economic power is temporary. Now, whenever economic power emerges, it's based upon your willingness to cooperate with the dominant player. And it's guided by what you want to accomplish in your life and everyone else. So it's not based upon force or violence as in political power. Whatever economic power emerges, it's out of the voluntary action because people want or they're willing to cooperate with that dominant player. So, for example, again, Amazon tends to be a dominant player because it serves most people's life purposes and that they don't see a better alternative yet. If a better alternative comes up, you are able very easily to move towards that new offering. But with political governance and political power, the options are much less, and it's much more difficult to escape political power. So it turns out then that political power and the political order that emerges from political power is much more problematic and it's much more dangerous than is the market order and the economic power that might be associated with it. So what we need to be concerned with, every citizen, in order to live a life that you want to live that is meaningful for you and is productive for your life purposes and for your family, whether it's or your friends for that matter, you must be mindful, you must be aware that the existence of political power is the greatest threat to your ability to live the life that you wish to live, or to discover what is the best life that you should live and can live. So let's look at this idea of the market order versus the political order. Now, as I mentioned, the market order provides incentives that tend to weaken economic power. Now, whenever a dominant player, for example, again, Amazon, begins to earn exceptional profits, that is, profits that are high enough to attract the attention of other entrepreneurs, then there'll be an attempt to offer an alternative, that is to compete with the existing providers. So this leads to what Schumpeter called creative destruction. That is, the dominant economic forces or the dominant economic player will tend to be challenged to the point where their political dominance disappears. This is what the creative destruction process is, that entrepreneurs are drawn to the exceptional profits and offer an alternative that, and if it is attractive to you, the consumer, you will abandon the dominant player and seek out the better option of the new and better offering, usually at a lower price or under better conditions. So what happens, if you think about it, the market order is something that we've lived with for literally centuries. And it supports trust among individuals. So when you go into the market, that is, if you wish to engage in market activities, if you go to Pollo Campero, you go there because you trust Pollo Campero, that if you go there, they will not make you sick. They will provide you with what they are offering, and the price will be as it's listed. And so you're willing to cooperate with that particular business, or you're willing to cooperate with the lady on the street that's selling tortillas. Every day when I walk to the university, there are these wonderful ladies wearing traditional trajes, selling tortillas and chile rellenos, so God knows what. I cooperate with them and they serve me. I see them as people that offer a potential to make my life better, and I'm willing to compensate them for that. So I trust them. I know that and the fact that they have been there every day for weeks and months, maybe years, I know that they are reliable. I trust them. So markets encourage trust among individual human beings. And this is very important. Now let's compare that with the political order. Now the political order, and most of us live, all of us here in this particular discussion live under something known as democracy. Now it turns out that this political system of political governance that we call democracy tends to allow both the expansion and the perpetuation of political power. Now, the market order tends to weaken economic power, but the existing system of political governance tends to expand and perpetuate political power. That's a stark difference. That's a very sharp difference. Now, instead of relying upon trust and relying upon this sort of cooperation, the political order depends upon compulsion. So compulsion or force replaces voluntary acts. How many of you would voluntarily pay your taxes or pay higher taxes or accept higher tax rates? Most people wouldn't. People pay taxes because they're forced to in most instances. And it turns out what happens then, instead of individuals serving other individuals based upon voluntary interactions in the market order, under the political order, citizens are compelled to be servants to the political order, or whatever the political elite decides must be done. So there's enormous differences between the market order. The market order is about choice, cooperation. The political order is about compulsion and direction, and about the individual serving not the collective in a sort of objective sense, but in an arbitrary sense. The collective is whatever the political leaders of that moment decide, which could be a particular interest group or a particular interpretation of what is good or what satisfies a sort of ideological goal of the political elite. So what we need to discuss and understand then is political power. One of my conclusions is, and I'll jump ahead of myself, is that political power is the only power we need to worry about. We don't worry about economic power, partly because it's transitory, it's temporary. Political power, as I mentioned, tends to be permanent, and it's difficult to contest. Now, so this is what I don't know if you've heard any of the lectures. Miguel Bastos, a professor from Spain, has visited Francisco Marroquin many times, and he discusses a great deal about the issue of political power. Now, he's influenced me in this regard to become somewhat pessimistic about the ability of classical liberalism as a general doctrine, or libertarianism, to deliver what it promises. So liberalism was all about an economic and political project to deliver human liberty. But it has tended to fail. It certainly failed in Russia. In the beginning of the 20th century, Russia had become, under the Tsar, become more and more liberal. That is, they were introducing lots of reforms to expand liberty and rights of the citizens of Russia. but it was overwhelmed by the Bolsheviks, and Soviet communism took over, complete failure. The same thing was happening in China at the beginning of the 20th century. The Sun Yat-sen and the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang in China, were introducing liberal politics. They failed, and the communists took over China. And so there's a tendency for liberalism to fail as a political concept to deliver human liberty and to protect rights. Now, why? Well, part of it is that economists really don't understand the nature or source of power, in particular political power. Most economic analysis just begins with, well, power is just something that exists. It's not something to resist, something to fight against. What happens is that economists tend to engage in a debate about how to expand human liberty more than how to restrain political power. And the opponents, or the proponents, the supporters of political power, don't worry about engaging in any kind of intellectual debate over human liberty. They can lose those debates as long as, like the Bolsheviks or like the Chinese Communist Party, as long as they are able to expand political power. They will engage in or ignore all these lovely arguments that liberal economists use about the beauty and the wonder and the importance of human liberty, because their ultimate ambition is to expand political power. So they tend to win. Now, on the other hand, political scientists are of no assistance because they don't understand economics. In particular, they don't understand how scarcity puts limits on the capacity of governments to provide privileges or subsidies or to expand public sector debt. They don't bother with the messy, the details of the restrictions on the ability of the state to give citizens this or that, because they really don't understand the restrictions that arise from scarcity. On the other hand, citizens really don't understand what democracy is about. And democracy, as it was in modern terms, what we see in modern democracy, say beginning in the 17th or 18th century, it was well understood that democracy was about limiting the powers of the state, because we were moving from a system of autocracy or monarchies where state power was more or less unlimited to a system of limited governance under the guise of democracy. But what's happened over time is that political power has become expanded and concentrated in the hands of political actors. In the United States, I grew up in the 1950s. In the 1950s, there was very little central power, that is, the power coming out of Washington in the United States. The central government was much less important than the state governments. So the state capitals, I'm from Georgia, Atlanta was the state capital. People that were seeking solutions to problems, they went to the state legislatures, they went to the state governors, and that's where problems tended to be solved. Today, in the space of about 60 years, we see that political power in the United States has now become concentrated in Washington, D.C. So that's a big change. So what happens is that political actors and ideologists, people who are driven by ideology, that oppose liberalism, and there are many of them, the socialists, social democrats, critical theorists or critical race theorists, they believe that if you expand political power, that is the way that you solve problems. So, for example, the Pope Francisco or many politicians, when they see what they believe are injustices, they believe the way to solve injustices is to give governments more power. In other words, to expand political power. So the current narrative about income inequalities, the Pope has declared income inequalities as the defining problem of our time. In other words, it's the biggest problem. And the Pope believes that the way to solve income inequalities is to give the state more power to increase taxes on those people who might have a relatively high level of income or perhaps wealth. Now, so in other words, their instinct is that more political power is a good thing. That is, it's not problematic. That is, you don't need to really find ways to ensure that that political power does not continuously expand or to become oppressive. It's a very naive sort of perspective on the world. And it's very troubling because the Pope has a very large influence on the opinions of people and the willingness of people to engage with their governments in terms of whether they accept the expansions of political power. Now, it turns out, if we are at all concerned with the idea of human liberty, democracy must be constrained. We must limit the ability of governments, the state, to acquire more power. Why? Well, because it tends to be permanent. It involves force. It's difficult to contest. All these reasons I gave you before. So we must, as citizens, we must resist whenever political actors tell us that it's in our interest to give up our liberties. We must be very cautious. We must be very skeptical. We must resist when political actors tell us those things, because if they acquire more power, we have less liberty. If they acquire more power, we have fewer rights. If they have more power, we have fewer resources, because they will insist that they need to take more from us in order for them to do what we have agreed to or allowed them to do. People don't always understand that that's really the sort of outcome of it. They just say, well, these political agents have promised us more security, or they promised us more, whatever it is they promised us. So those are the benefits, but we might not think carefully or cautiously about what are the costs of acquiring that security or those promises of the state actors. Now, what the unfortunate thing, now when I grew up in the United States, the idea of democracy was really the sort of ultimate goal. It was expressed, if we go back to, for example, Woodrow Wilson during World War I made a remark that America should help make the world safe for democracy. In other words, the United States would commit itself to promote democracy in other countries. And so we should interfere with the activities of other governments to ensure that there is democracy. John F. Kennedy said at one point during his presidency during the early 1960s that America would go anywhere and pay any price in order to promote democracy. Now, what was wrong with both of those statements is that, it was a naive understanding that democracy was a mechanism to deliver liberty, human liberty. But democracy is not an end. It is a means. The end has to be human liberty. And unfortunately, democracy as it has evolved since the beginning of the modern experiments toward democracy, beginning in the United States or France or other parts of the world, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, or even the Russian Revolution, was supposed to be about people becoming free from the imposition of autocratic or monarchs, and to have sovereignty. But in fact, what's happened over time is democracy is about expanding political power. Instead of promoting life, liberty, and property of every citizen equally. If you look at the American founding documents, the Declaration of Independence or the American Constitution, it states clearly that the purpose of the government, as it was seen at that time, was to promote life, liberty, and property of everyone equally. So no one should be treated better than any other person. Now, of course, unfortunately, given the existing conditions of the time, when the United States was formed, we had this horrible system of slavery. They were doing their best to deal with that problem. And they were laying out a political system that would anticipate the end of slavery, as almost all of the founding fathers anticipated, that slavery was seen as an unsupportable institution that went against the general principles of liberalism, and that it would sooner or later disappear. But there had to be a certain amount of political pragmatism in order to move the political system in that direction. Now, let's think about the aspect of political power. Now, this idea of political power has evolved over time as the basis of authority. Now, if we go back to the beginning of, well, say the 16th and 17th century, or even before, there was what was known as the divine right of kings. So the absolute monarchs of Europe, their power was based upon a God-given sort of covenant, that is an agreement that God gave them the power to rule over their people. And so they could do whatever they believed was necessary or good. Now, of course, this left them up to any kind of arbitrary decisions, and their decisions were not necessarily based upon what was good for the citizens or the people beneath them. It was based upon what was good for the monarchy, to perpetuate the monarchy, to perpetuate the state power. So these could be very arbitrary. And the influence of citizens was almost non-existent. Now, this evolved and gave way to what we now know as the rule of law. Instead of the rule of man or the rule of an absolute monarch, we have a rule of law. And this was introduced to a large degree. It can be traced to this Estado de Derecho, can be traced to the Magna Carta, which was a document that the lords of Great Britain imposed upon the King of England, that required that the king accept a sort of equal status with the lords. Now, what that eventually evolved into is that the leaders of a country had equal status with the citizens. And that's what the rule of law is. The rule of law is that the leaders or the government officials have equal status, not superior status, as in the divine right of kings, but equal status. They're no better, they're no worse, they're treated equally. And so that the idea was that the rule of law, and requiring that the political leaders have equal status to citizens, that this was a way to promote and protect human liberty and the common good by limiting the ability of political leaders to arbitrarily use political power. And the political power to give themselves privileges, that is, as the leaders, or to give their supporters privileges. This was unacceptable under the rule of law. The idea of privileges is a violation of the rule of law because political leaders, whether politicians or bureaucrats, do not have elevated statuses over the citizens. Indeed, they are supposed to be our servants. Political leaders are meant to be the servants of citizens. Now, unfortunately, what we're beginning to see is that there's a divine right of the majority. So we've actually moved away from the limits imposed by the rule of law, where people have begun to accept democracy as a sort of a divine right for the political actors of that day to do whatever they wish to do, based upon the majority, the vote of the majority of the electorate that gave them indications of what the majority wishes. In the beginning, the entire purpose of limited democracy was to stop that. That even majorities should not be able to request or demand that the political actors do more than what the Constitution or the rule of law allowed them to. And the rule of law, which was a guiding sort of metaphysical concept, was that politicians cannot grant privileges to themselves or to their political supporters or of any interest group. Unfortunately, democracy does not operate that way. So we now have a corrupted sense of a social contract, so that whatever the majority decides is more or less acceptable. So we either depend upon an election to give us a result of what the majority wants, or we have a poll. We have polling groups that ask people, what do you like? What do you want? What do you think the politicians should do? And this is what drives, in many cases, public policy. But this isn't the way it was meant to be. Governments were meant to, democracy was meant to be limited by the rule of law or the constitutions, and that politicians could not arbitrarily choose what they want to do. So it turns out we really don't have good choices. It's the same here in Guatemala as it is in America. All political parties seek the expansion of political power because they will tell us that they will do better than the ones that they want to replace. So if we have political power, even under democracy, as I mentioned, it relies on force. And what we have are man-made rules, these legislative statutes that serve political or ideological goals, and they almost all violate the rule of law. So if we look at every legislative rule, whether in the United States, in Guatemala, in France, or in the Philippines, almost all legislative acts are granting a subsidy. Now, a subsidy means that one group receives benefits that another group has to pay for. So that's a privilege. A subsidy is a privilege. Or the legislative acts give protections to a particular business or an industry, and the rest of the population suffers the consequences in terms of higher prices or lower quality because of the protections given to the domestic producer, the domestic industry. These violate the rule of law. These are privileges. But legislators, they don't care. And unfortunately, the citizens are not conscious of this problem. So these violations perpetuate. And what we have then are these legislated rules that become permanent and influence our lives. So it turns out that unlimited democracy is as dangerous as autocracy. In other words, if politicians can arbitrarily decide to give themselves privileges, or if they can give privileges to particular groups based upon their access to political power, based upon a majority vote, then we are not necessarily in a better place than we were before these revolutions that existed or that occurred in the 18th and 19th century against the autocrats, the monarchs. Now, what is it about political power that matters? Well, political power is being expanded through democracy. So, unfortunately, democracy is no longer our salvation. If democracy was supposed to save us from the arbitrary rule of autocrats and the granting of privileges that came from that. But now democracy has become much the same in that regard. It's about giving privileges. Now, the democratic vote that we see, even in liberal democracies, it's an expression of a momentary and accidental majority. I don't know if you followed it, but there's something known as Brexit, where the United Kingdom, the citizens of the United Kingdom voted on whether or not they should leave the European Union. And it turned out that they decided they would leave. It's a very narrow majority of those that voted. Now, if that election had taken place a week before or a week after, the result might have been different. Almost certainly would have been different. Because, you know, the headlines of the day before, or the headlines the day after, could have influenced certain voters to vote one way or another, or some voters to vote or not to vote, or to participate, or not to participate, to stay home. So the outcome of a particular vote is not really an objective reading of the desires of the population. It's only of that particular moment. So that moment might be driven by some particular event like 9/11. After the attack on the United States during the 9/11, the Congress was able to pass very extensive regulation that allowed surveillance, spying on not only foreigners, but also American citizens. That probably would never have passed without the passions, the reaction to 9/11. So if that had been attempted a week before, if 9/11 had never occurred a week after. So those kind of rules, those kind of decisions are really, now, but they tend to be permanent. Those did not go away. In fact, the right of spying on American citizens has expanded over time. So it turns out that in the end, all of these things tend to be permanent. I'm running out of time. So why do we worry about legislative rules? As I mentioned before, in the extreme, they could lead to violence or death. They constantly grow and they constantly become more complex. Even though they're said to be good choices in the will of people, in the end, we have less freedom. And it turns out that the political institutions, democracy does not lead to our leaders delivering what's in the best interest of most of the citizens. And if you've studied any public choice, you would understand that better. Now, what about economic power? The revolutions were fought against political power. We didn't chop off the heads of kings because they were rich. They were rich because they were able to take away from other people. Robin Hood rebelled not because the people were rich. He rebelled against the sheriff of Nottingham. In other words, the people who became rich by taxing the productive people. Why do people not like the rich? Well, you should not like the rich that get rich if they use political power to enrich themselves. But don't worry about Jeff Bezos and Amazon or Elon Musk, because if their wealth and income comes from competitive markets, then it's from your cooperation with them. Now, so market power is not really problematic. It's only permanent if the state protects it, and then it's a problem of political power. And markets will always destroy monopoly if they're competitive, if the state does not intervene. Now, why do we want human liberty? Well, it allows us to discover what it is we want to accomplish in our lives. And in doing so, it creates more prosperity that tends to be shared with everyone. Now, morally, it's because we have a natural right to be free from being dominated by other people. In other words, we should own ourselves, that the state doesn't own us. The community doesn't own us. We should be the masters of our destiny. So liberty, not democracy, should be the goal. So freedom is more important than voting rights. And constitutional rights, constitutional constraints, and the rule of law are the way to try to promote human liberty and limit the abuse of power by both individuals and the majority. In other words, the state. So when we give the state more power, we've been dehumanized. That is, we become less human. We become objects rather than destiny. Now, what's wrong with the pandemic policies? Crises like the pandemic allow political actors to expand their power. Now, there's a tendency for politicians to understand that it's better to make a bad choice than to do nothing. So politicians tend to be more active oriented when there's a crisis. Even if they have incomplete information, if they have bad information, they say, well, I tried to do something. They're more worried about being blamed for doing nothing than for doing the wrong thing. And so they wind up doing the wrong thing. That's their first impact, is that fear was used to compel people to accept less freedom. And politicians turned to experts to justify the control. So in other words, science followed policy because the politicians decided on what they wanted. Then they found experts to support what it is they felt was the right thing to do. In the end, what we see with pandemic policies is that the collective is elevated over the individual. So individuals had to submit to authority and serve the public good. Group benefits were exaggerated, individual costs ignored. So what we saw is that we're going to save lives with lockdowns. We're going to save lives with mask wearing. But they didn't tell you, but we're going to sacrifice lives to social isolation that causes depression and suicide. We're going to sacrifice lives because of the loss of economic freedom, that we're going to destroy businesses so that people will lose their livelihoods. So what happened is that the benefits were exaggerated and the costs were underestimated. The worst part, I think, of these pandemic policies is the destruction of trust and the willingness to people to openly interact with each other. What happens now is that people don't trust each other. They fear others. When I walk the streets of Guatemala, I don't wear a mask outside. And when people see me, they're afraid of me. I can see them moving away from me. Now, this is anti-scientific. This goes against every kind of medical understanding. When you're outside with open air and lots of ventilation, the possibility of transmission of a virus is infinitesimally small. But fear has become so ingrained in people that they are willing to submit to policies like mask wearing that are completely irrelevant and inappropriate. Now, once governments get this power, they don't give it up. It ratchets up. It goes up. It doesn't come down. Why? Because politicians will not acknowledge they made a mistake. They will not admit that mask wearing is irrelevant, especially outside. And that as a general strategy, it is not necessary. Lockdowns are like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. So once lockdowns are imposed, the next wave of a respiratory virus that will come, as it will with the lower temperatures in the winter, governments will say, we need to lock down again. Now, Sweden knew that. That's why they never accepted lockdowns, because they know that there is no good exit strategy. So the state, as an instrument of political power, is the only permanent source of oppression. It's not income inequality. It's not the market. It's the state that oppresses us. Political actors can always compel us to do what they want. It's hard to contest and almost impossible to reverse. The citizens must understand that we cannot go along with granting or asking for more political power. Whenever there's more state control, private sector actors will use political power to their advantage. This is what we call cronyism, where special interest groups use so for example, Elon Musk uses the subsidies granted to electric car production as a way of expanding Tesla. So democracy is like Botox. Botox is a deadly toxin. In small doses, it makes older women, and sometimes old people like me, look better, or at least they think they look better. But in large doses, it will kill them. So think of democracy like Botox. It should only be there. We should only use democracy in very limited applications, and only for those specified powers that we grant to leaders. So we should follow the rule of law and insist that political governance not involve the granting of privileges. Okay, sorry, I think I went over time, but if you have questions, contact me at this email, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was an absolute pleasure. I personally enjoy a lot the conference. It was really cool. And on behalf of Centro Henry Hazlitt at Universidad Francisco Marroquín, I thank you for attending this conference.
Thank you very much.
For everyone watching, thank you. And for everyone watching, please join us tomorrow for the last CHH conference of the semester, called Rising from the Crisis, Advancing the Future of the Free Society. The conference is going to be given by Martín Kraus, visiting professor at UFM Ramón Parellada, UFM treasurer, and Nikolai Wenzel, distinguished professor of economics at Fayetteville State University.
I highly encourage you to participate tomorrow, because these are absolutely outstanding people, much better than me.
You were really good, though. The bar is pretty high.
We enjoy a lot.
Again, thank you very much for your attention, and good afternoon to all.
Ciao.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao tutti.